When people hear about AI or they think about AI, it's something that's sort of much sexier, like what you see in movies with like fancy robots doing all sorts of different things. Nowadays, the advancement of AI has created photos and video are no longer reliable sources of reality.
Meifan, an investor and board member with over 18 years of experience at the intersection of finance and tech. Meifan has held leadership positions in companies like BlackBerry, T-Mobile, and Amazon Web Services, where she actually helped build their private equity business, growing their portfolio to over 800 billion in AUM. As managing partner at Waterpoint Lane, she's driving investments in agri-food tech.
AI, like any tool, it can be used for good and it can also be used for evil. There were just these crazy overvalued companies that had massive valuations, no business model. I think today, in many ways, AI has that same kind of hype in what we're doing as the internet did back then.
Do you think AI is more likely to displace jobs, or do you see it as something that will primarily assist people in their roles?
I am a technology person at heart. I'm going to say this, like AI has been displacing jobs. The best way to make money is not to lose money in the first place.
Hello, welcome back to another episode of Simple Tech Talk, where we discuss the impact of AI across different businesses and industries. I'm your host, Taran Agarwal, and today we are excited to have Meifan, an investor and board member with over 18 years of experience at the intersection of finance and tech. Meifan has held leadership positions in companies like BlackBerry, T-Mobile, and Amazon Web Services, where she actually helped build their private equity business, growing their portfolio to over 800 billion in AUM. That's billion with a B. Now, as managing partner at Waterpoint Lane, she's driving investments in agri-food tech and sustainability while shaping NYC's venture ecosystem. Meifan, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Tran.
Could you start by sharing a little about your journey and the work that you're currently doing?
Absolutely. So my background's always been in technology. I started off with an undergrad in electrical engineering. I'm actually Canadian, so I grew up in a town called Kingston, which is just a few hours north of Toronto. So I started off with, companies like BlackBerry that were at the very sort of, very forefront of technology at the time. They came out with the QWERTY keyboard, which was extremely popular across a number of different enterprises and quickly overtook the market. And so my interest and my background in technology remained and moved out to Silicon Valley early on in my career to take part and be part of a number of different teams for both startups as well as Fortune 500 companies. And so I really had an opportunity to, get a feel for what it was like to be at a startup while also holding roles, leadership roles within Fortune 500 types of companies. But further along, I realized I really wanted to get in on the investment side. At that point, I had a number of years to work with venture capitalists, be part of the fundraising process. And so ultimately, in order to get that financial experience, I decided that I need to be in New York City. And so I moved out to the East Coast and, stayed in New York City for about 12 years. During that time, I also went to grad school, went to Columbia, did my MBA, and shortly thereafter joined Amazon Web Services to start their private equity business development team and build that out. So I had a lot of opportunities there to work with, very large firms such as Blackstone, Warburg, where I really was at the forefront of kind of watching a lot of the deals going through, a lot of the value creation that was happening within the portfolio, and also to be a part of that journey as well. And so it was really fascinating for me to be a part of a number of different, industries while I was working with these private equity firms and also working with a lot of the CEOs of these portfolio companies to help them build their business, as well as really help them drive their technology strategy as well. And so I really was fascinated by the whole process. And I knew that I wanted to kind of start my own fund. But I didn't really get a chance to do that until more recently, where I reconnected with my business partner, Ben Gibbons. He and I had actually worked together at our last corporate role. And so we always, sort of shared a common interest in terms of deals, in terms of building out a fund. And so last year, so he actually, started off first, building out an SPV on his own, doing individual deals. And then when the two of us reconnected, we talked about starting our own fund. And I was like, hey, look, if this is something that you'd like to do, I'd love to work on that with you. And so that's kind of how Waterpoint Lane, Fund One was born. And so we actually started our journey at in June of last year. That's when we did our first close. And so we're kind of close to closing out our first fund, hopefully, fingers crossed before the end of this year. And the focus has been, late seed stage companies in the tech and food tech industry.
Oh, what amazing story, Meifan. Starting off in electric engineering to playing a key role in AWS, and then getting into private equity, and then finding your own fund right now. It's really amazing how your experience has evolved from cutting edge tech to investing in game changing industries. I think that kind of varied background gives one such a unique perspective on innovation overall. And speaking of innovation, earlier when we were chatting, you touched a little bit upon AI's role in agri-food tech, which has been your focus in Waterpoint Lane. So particularly around optimizing decision making for farmers. So I would love to dive a little deeper into that. Could you share a little more about some of the AI driven innovations that you're seeing that are reshaping agriculture and the broader food ecosystem?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of what is driving, some of the farmer economics and some of the transformation in the industry is around data. And so that encompasses everything from data collection and integration. So, on a very simple basis, when you look at modern farms using a variety of different tools such as sensors, IoT devices, drones, there's all sorts of different ways that this data is being aggregated and collected in order to help farmers, to help the corporations themselves as they're looking at growing their ecosystem and also creating, sort of making those improvements on the agricultural operations side. And a lot of the data analysis and applications that we see, it's something as simple as measuring water efficiency, looking at energy efficiency. There's been a number of different companies we've worked with that are looking at different factors in terms of the implementation of the information as well as, different predicting different crop yields, disease outbreaks, optimal planting and harvesting times. There's also, a lot of it around risk management and decision support. So one of the biggest things around investment management, of course, is managing the risk as well. And I think, Warren Buffett said it best. He said the best way to make money is not to lose money in the first place. And
So
so
true.
that's where you see a lot of the AI and data, playing a factor into the risk management and decision support. So one such example of this is if you look at harvest times. So especially, now during hurricane season, there's a lot of different, weather patterns, a lot of different storms that are coming in that affect different areas that are agricultural centers. And so being able to, do something as simple as manage risks related to weather, that has an immediate impact on the economics, whether it's from farmer perspective, from market conditions. That's on a very simple basis, something that we see across a number of different companies that we've been looking at. Another big part of it is on the supply chain optimization side. And so a lot of that data-driven agriculture goes beyond just the farm. It's also, sort of that entire circular economy. So you're looking at reducing food waste, you're looking at improving traceability, you're looking at enhanced distribution efficiencies. There's also, the biodiversity management side of it. That's one of the biggest things that, when we talk about climate change, we talk about some of the different things around sustainability. Biodiversity is a huge part of it. But the thing is, in order to manage biodiversity, you have to know what's out there in the first place. And so the AI and a lot of the data and the tools that are being used there are a large part of what goes into sort of the agricultural productivity and environmental conservation as well. And then, we'll see more and more. There's a lot of compliance, and different regulations that are going into place. Everyone's heard about the net zero carbon objectives have been put into place by a number of different companies as well as globally. And so, in order to really make those types of impacts, it's really important to be able to measure those KPIs in the first place. So, the data and sort of the aggregation of that data and the analytics behind it are a huge part of what's driving sort of the AI usage there. I wish I could. Well, I don't wish I could say this, but it's interesting that a lot of times when people hear about AI or they think about AI, it's something that's sort of much sexier, like what you see in movies with like fancy robots doing all sorts of different things. So a lot of it right now is not really oriented around that. There is some of that through the drones and IoT systems, but a lot of it is around the data and analytics.
100%. Like with the point of being robots, it almost feels like we are entering the Terminator era. It feels so sci-fi, to be very honest. But it's really it's very fascinating, Meifan. I love how AI is not only improving efficiencies on the farm, but also optimizing the entire supply chain from, reducing food waste to managing biodiversity, as you said, which is such a critical issue in the face of climate change. And I'm particularly intrigued by your point of risk management as someone who worked in risk management earlier at BlackRock, especially using AI to kind of predict and mitigate risks related to weather patterns, which sounds like such a game changer for farmers and even investors alike. Uh, could you share a little bit more about how this AI driven risk management works in practice, perhaps with a specific example of how it's helping farmers or businesses navigate extreme weather events or other unpredictable factors?
Absolutely. So, one of the interesting ones that we've seen is, around the use with weather related patterns, especially around harvest. And so
Mhm.
a number of different so one of the companies that we looked at, they were using predictive analytics to basically provide farmers with the intelligence to be able to run their businesses effectively. And so what they've created sort of the SaaS model whereby they're going out to a lot of their larger customers. And because farming has evolved quite a bit, sort of in modern society, there are actually a lot of farms are no longer run by farmers. They're actually run by corporations. And so there's a bit of a bifurcation between some of the smaller, more, local farms versus the very large corporations that actually run, tens of thousands of acres of the farms that are out there. And so their business model was very focused around being able to help with the farmers around the harvest time, looking at the weather patterns, being able to predict the produce, down to the level of being able to predict, what sort of produce would be the most effective, be the most economical. And we've seen technology gone to such an advanced stage where there's been, a lot of conversations as well as, we've seen it being integrated into commercial use as well around genomics. And so there's, sort of different thoughts around, around the DNA of crops, around produce, should that be altered? How can it be altered? Depending on which side you take, there's a number of ways you can look at it. But from an analytical perspective, what these technologies are doing is really helping, the food security and sort of, mitigating a lot of that unpredictable risk that was previously causing a lot of issues, especially when it came to harvest time. So that's one example of a number of different ways that it's being used. On the other hand, as well, not just with plants, but with livestock. So we've seen a lot of incredible technology, a recognition perspective. And so they're able to sort of detect different types of fish. So we've seen this frequently used with fish farming. Unfortunately, fish farming is sort of a bit of a necessary evil in terms of in terms of feeding the general population. Fish is very widely consumed on a global basis, and so there's a lot of issues there, just as we've seen with poultry, with cows. There are diseases, there are different types of issues that pop up. And so what we'll see is the way some of these predictive technologies, what they're able to do is kind of be able to detect disease, be able to detect any sort of issues that are happening on the farm, and are able to mitigate a lot of the risks that will come, especially when it comes to livestock, right? Disease, it can be very it can be very unpredictable. You don't know how it's going to affect the livestock, and so being able to get ahead of it is a very important part of of the technology that's being used there.
100%. Early detection of diseases is definitely such a game changer, and it's clear how powerful AI can be when it comes to helping large scale farms manage risks and optimize the harvest, especially with
Yes.
the predictive analytics and even genomics now coming into play. And the SaaS model you mentioned is a great example of how I guess tech innovation is scaling within the agriculture sector. I'm curious though. Earlier we touched on the ethical considerations around AI. Now, with the divide you mentioned between smaller local farms and larger corporate farms using advanced tech, do you think there's a risk of AI widening this gap? Like, how do you see smaller farms being able to keep up with these advancements, or is there like a role for AI to actually help bridge the divide?
No, exactly. I think AI, like any tool, it can be used for good and it can also be used for evil. It is certainly something that multiplies very, very quickly. So if a company or a farm has the resources and the capabilities to scale, that is something that they can use within their systems to really help them manage their produce, whether it's through their produce or livestock. and also their overall systems integration. However, what you will see is, and this is something that's come up often, right, is the dissemination of false information. AI nowadays, the advancement of AI has created, nowadays photos and video are no longer reliable sources of reality. So using AI, you can create false photos, false information, and that's certainly not limited to ag tech. That's something that's happening across the board. And so, depending on how it's used, there could be some issues there in terms of the detection, but also in terms of, the way that it's being used from a data perspective. The other thing too is from a privacy perspective, that, digital privacy has been an issue for a long time. No matter how many layers of security you might have on there, there's always different ways that there's a hacker somewhere that will find some way to break
Always.
into the system,
Always.
right? And be able to break in, steal information, on the lower end, they steal some information that's not really that detrimental. But on the other end, if you're looking at, genomics, if you're looking at, altering DNA for crops, that kind of information is very dangerous. It could be used in a very, bad way, which will then perpetuate a lot of the issues because through technology, things kind of multiply exponentially very, very quickly. And so when something goes wrong, it has the potential to scale exponentially in a very bad way. And so that's another thing that we have to really look out for. And then one of the other things as well is in terms of bias. So you hear a lot about AI and bias when it comes to recruiting, when it comes to, sort of making judgment calls, with law enforcement, any kind of bias that is programmed within AI, it has the ability to perpetuate very, very quickly, way more so than having, what used to be humans in the chain, kind of handle those that decision making. And so in order to mitigate that, you need to make sure that you have very diverse teams and look at the process that the AI sort of does the learning, the machine learning as it grows, as it continues. Because what you don't want to do is for that machine learning to perpetuate in the wrong way. And I think that continues to be one of the bigger challenges, that lies within AI is, whoever's designing it, whoever's kind of creating it, they need to make very sure that they are doing it in a way, that ensures that propagation is going the right way, which is very difficult, right? Because, and also too, that's subjective as well. So one person's right or wrong or specific direction may not necessarily be the same as someone else's. And so again, that's why it makes it very important to be able to, make sure that you have the right teams that are doing this, that are
So
doing
true.
the decision making.
What an insightful perspective. And I completely agree. Like AI, like any other powerful tool, can have both positive and negative impacts depending on how it's used. And the concerns you raised about misinformation and privacy are definitely becoming more prevalent across industries. It's interesting how you point out AI bias too. It's something we've seen in areas like recruitment, law enforcement, but it's also starting to creep into agriculture, which could have serious implications for decision making, like you said. With that said, let's pivot to your expertise in private equity and venture capital. You've spent years identifying and fostering value in different industries. So, how do you see AI transforming investment strategies, especially in helping to, let's say, identify high potential startups and evaluating risk in emerging markets?
Yeah, so there's definitely a number of different ways technology and especially AI can help in the investment management industry. So for years it's been used, in terms of data analytics, predictive analysis. So one of the ways definitely from a due diligence perspective, so there's so many different tools now that use AI to kind of comb through data, comb through different, inconsistencies, looking at financial statements. There are some fundamental, every investment firm has their own, methodology and secret sauce, if you will. But one of the biggest things that, that we use AI for is, of course, for that initial kind of scrub, through many of the deals and companies that we get. And so there's a number of different factors we look for, whether that be financial, whether that be operational. There's different formats that the data comes in. So we wish everything would come in into a very clean, nice way and it all comes very consistent. But of course, that's not the way it works. And so there's a lot of different things that we have to think about. So, aside from the financial strategy, marketing information, there's also things like patents, there's also product reviews, sentiment, looking at a lot of different ways, looking at management teams, evaluating that. And so while that used to be an extremely manual process, there are now, a lot of different tools that can be used to sort of enhance that due diligence aspect of it and be able to aggregate the data in a much better way. And of course, there's also the trend identification, market prediction piece. There's a lot of different things, for in terms of, especially when it comes to exits, right? Because we get a lot of feedback, and we also know this as well. There's been frustration with the ag tech industry because there haven't been a lot of exits. People associate ag tech with sort of like a much longer term investment. And so, as a result of that, there's always questions around, hey, are these really, sort of these amazing cutting edge companies? Like, why would I invest in an ag tech company versus something that could, exit a lot sooner, like biotech? And so, in terms of the, trend identification and market prediction, that's another area where the AI can be helpful in terms of, sort of matching and looking at the economic indicators, you know, pulling together geopolitical events, industry specific metrics. And so that's another area where that predictive analytics comes into play. And as a part of that, right, and what we talked about a little bit earlier, risk assessment is definitely a huge part of it. You take into account the different, stress tests, the portfolio companies, market conditions, regulatory risks. So increasingly, compliance, especially with geopolitical risks, there's a lot of different things that need to be taken into account. And especially when you're looking at global companies, you have to really take into account all of the different geopolitical, risks
So
there
true.
as well.
So true.
Yeah, and then valuation, of course, the biggest one, right? And sort of where the valuations come from, especially at an earlier stage with portfolio companies. I'm sure you'll recall, back in the day with the internet boom, there were these internet companies that were being valued at crazy, crazy valuations, and just, everything was a multi-billion dollar unicorn, right? And it's at the end of the day, when you look at that, are those companies really worth it? And so, that's another area where AI can really help in terms of, at least doing some of the analysis and pulling some of that information together, more of the assessments.
100%. What a great insight, my friend. We'll get into the internet boom. I definitely have a question regarding that. But first, it's amazing how AI now has the ability to analyze not just financials, like you said, but strategy, market sentiment, and even patterns, which is such a game changer for identifying high potential startups. And you also mentioned about how it streamlines due diligence and provides deeper insights that would have taken so much of manual effort in the past. That kind of brings me to the next topic, which is AI's impact on jobs, with the manual effort of it. Some people worry that AI and, the automation in AI will replace a lot of jobs, while others see it more as a tool that will enhance human capabilities. So, what's your take on this? Do you think AI is more likely to displace jobs, or do you see it as something that will primarily assist people in their roles?
Yeah, so even though I am a technology person at heart, I'm going to say this, like AI has been displacing jobs and it will continue to displace jobs,
Yep.
certain types of jobs. And so you will see things that are sort of repeat, that are on repeat, so sort of these monotonous, things that you can do over and over again, which is easy for a machine to replicate. Those jobs are being displaced. So you're looking at things in manufacturing, you're looking at some of the things in customer care. Like a lot of questions nowadays are being answered by AI agents as opposed to calling directly and being able to speak to a human being. I can't remember the last time I was actually able to speak to a human being through customer care. So, a lot of this is being handled by AI. However, what I do see is that, it's like I said, it impacts certain industries, but it's not necessarily across, it's uneven. So things that, like I was saying before, like retail, transportation, more routine, repetitive tasks, those industries are going to be heavily impacted. And they already have, especially in manufacturing, where a lot of what used to be the human assembly lines have now been replaced by robots that can work 24/7. Other industries, such as healthcare, education, where you see more of a human touch, that requires more of a human touch to it, I don't expect to, see those disappear. I think that while teachers may use AI, they may use technology to sort of enhance, and teachers are just one example, of course, to enhance their capabilities, they're using AI as tools that will greatly enhance their ability to provide education, not just to local students, but also have global reach. And in things such as healthcare, where they're able to We've seen things like surgeons performing life-saving surgery from different parts of the globe where they otherwise might not have been able the patient might not have been able to get access. In that case, they're able to use the AI, they're able to use the technology to greatly enhance the experience. So that's where I see, so some of the previous more traditional jobs, do you see that being displaced? But it's also going to create additional opportunities. So as an example, from a content creation perspective, we've seen a lot of increases with AI that has been enhancing some of that content creation. So for example, we've seen marketing agencies that are increasingly using AI to, create content, to create artistic content, but it still needs to pass through someone that sort of has that eye, between the art and the science part of it. It still needs to go through a person that has that experience and expertise, while the AI might be able to, for example, do a certain part of it, maybe start off the project, or not able to necessarily finish it. From an investment perspective, as I mentioned, we certainly use AI to help us with a lot of the analytics, with a lot of the prediction, with a lot of the other sort of repetitive tasks that we need to do. But at the end of the day, in order for us to make a decision, an investment decision, we have folks that review everything and kind of put everything together in aggregate. So to answer your question, yes, it certainly is displacing, certain types of roles and especially across certain industries. But on the other hand, as well, it's going to create new opportunities, and it also is going to, force a lot of folks to kind of be elevated to a different level. So rather than sort of doing the more administrative part of that role, they will now take on a more supervisory role of reviewing and editing and sort of making that final decision as opposed to kind of doing the administrative part of the role before.
100%. That's a really balanced take, and I completely agree. It's clear that while AI is displacing certain repetitive tasks, it's also opening up new opportunities, especially in areas where the human touch is still irreplaceable, like you said, with healthcare and education. But the idea that AI can enhance human capabilities rather than outright replace them is really important, especially in industries where creativity, empathy, and I feel like complex problem solving are key. You mentioned AI enabling remote surgeries or improving teaching methods, which just goes to show how it's more of a partnership between humans and machines in those fields, which is fascinating. But at the same time, you also mentioned people using AI for content. And I personally feel like nowadays on the internet, at least on LinkedIn and stuff, all of the content looks the same to me because it's
Because
all
they're
of
all going
the.
through the same engine, right? They're
Yeah,
going to ChatGPT and saying, "Hey, write this." And then you're like, "Hey,
exactly.
wait a second."
Exactly. Even when you put in your thoughts and you
Yeah.
just say, okay, tweak it for clarity or rewrite
Yeah.
stuff, it's mostly just recycled content. I had some other guest on my podcast and he referred to this phenomena as AI incest, which was really funny to me. But yeah, it's interesting how it's affecting content in a way. Definitely producing more content and giving more insights, but at the same time, I feel like it's a bit repetitive and weird in a way, just because everyone's posting out the same content. But
Yes.
earlier you mentioned the internet bubble, and it got me thinking. Many people are drawing comparisons between the current AI boom and what we see with the dot com bubble, right? So, do you think that comparison holds up? And what lessons from that era should we be applying to how AI is evolving so quickly today?
Yeah, that's such a great question because when you look at the internet boom, there were just these crazy overvalued companies that, like I was saying before, had massive valuations, no business model. It was just hype and marketing. And it really created a lot of chaos in the markets, obviously. And there was a lot of, spend on R&D, crazy technologies that would somehow transform things. I think today, in many ways, AI has that same kind of hype in what we're doing as the internet did back then. But it is more thoughtful in terms of, when we look at companies and their valuations, and especially from an investment perspective, you're not seeing the similar types of, crazy valuations that you were seeing back then. There's a lot more, I think there's been some learning from that era where there's still a lot more diligence that's being done from investors. They are much more thoughtful about business model. In fact, we're part of a number of different consortiums with other investors. Also when we speak with our LPs, a lot of the conversation is around business model and around, sort of how they're working, both operationally, financially, a number of different areas. Whereas back then, I know that there was not that sort of consideration around business models. Like, oh wow, like whatever was the coolest, most unlikely thing to happen. It was like, okay, yeah, that sounds great. That should be worth $2 billion, right? And nowadays it's not like that anymore. We've come across a lot of different AI companies. We've come across a lot of different things. Even within ag tech that utilize all of these sort of droids, robotics, all of these sort of fancy AI of the future types of things. And no longer are people looking at them and going, "Oh wow, okay, we're just gonna go and invest," and hopefully that turns into like a multi-billion dollar, multi-billion dollar company a year from now. So I think there's definitely been a lot of lessons learned. I do think AI is very, very much hyped right now in terms of the technology itself and the interest in learning about it. I see more and more folks, regardless of what industry they're affiliated with, they're taking interest in understanding technology, learning how to code, trying to understand AI. It's a lot more accessible as a technology versus it was back then. So definitely
100%.
a lot of similarities, but also, thankfully, a lot of differences as well.
For sure. That's a great point. And the parallels between the AI boom and the internet bubble are definitely there in terms of excitement and hype, but it's kind of reassuring to hear that the investment landscape is much more thoughtful now with the focus on viable business models rather than just, inflated valuations like it was back then. It seems like we have learned a lot from the past. I wasn't born then, but seems like the world has learned. And that's making this wave of innovation more sustainable. But no, like shifting
Exactly. So you've only heard about it from like your parents and your parents'
yeah,
generation.
and all of my podcast guests, because that's a common question I ask,
Yep.
and I can
Yes.
only formulate opinions, but I wasn't born then, so yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
I
I've lived through it, so
yeah, okay, that's why your perspective is so deep in that regard. But now shifting gears a bit, Meifan, outside of professional work, do you use AI in your personal life? Are there any AI tools or apps that you rely on for productivity, learning, or even for your hobbies?
absolutely. So one of the things I use AI a lot for is in learning.
Right.
So there's like a number of different. So I use Duolingo in from a language perspective. So I'm trying to become fluent in French. So I've tried out a lot of different sort of AI oriented language apps.
Oh, that's
And
awesome.
yeah, so I settled on Duolingo. I think it's still the best in terms of, understanding, learning your, what level you're at, kind of continually changing the interaction to help you improve the areas, helping you find your mistakes. So that's one of the biggest areas I use it in. I also use it for other areas of my life. So, for example, health, health monitoring. I find that it's helpful to be able to, monitor some of your data as well as your exercise patterns. From a meals perspective. So health and wellness is another area that I use AI for. So it's not completely evil. It is, it does serve a very good, a very good use. But yeah, I'm not going to be one of those people that kind of talks to AI. I think talking, I'm going to reserve that for my friends and people and family in my life. I don't think that AI replaces, from a psychology perspective, doesn't replace a human being and sort of, kind of takes that. I'm sure a lot of people will disagree with me on that.
There would,
Eh,
some
yeah,
would.
but you're definitely too young to remember this, but there was a time when there were these digital pets that were out there, and you've probably heard about that from your parents' friends. And that was supposed to be, to help with your mental wellness. Like, I don't believe in any of that stuff. I think, if you want to get a pet, get a real pet,
Yeah.
not a digital pet. That's my perspective on that.
So that's really interesting. That's really interesting. And I love how you're using AI in practical ways like language learning, health monitoring, and like, Duolingo's ability. Even I use it a lot. I also use it to learn French and its ability to just, yeah, it's just ability to be able to adapt to your learning level is such a smart use of AI. And it's incredible how those small optimizations can lead to massive, massive real progress. Mifan, you earlier briefly touched upon the use cases for teachers, right? Which kind of got me to thinking about students. With the growing reliance on AI among students today, like, whether they use it for generating their essays, whether they use it for more productive reasons like research, do you think this could affect their critical thinking and problem solving capabilities in the long run? Or do you see AI as a tool that can perhaps enhance those skills? Because you also mentioned how we can code up stuff using no code platforms. So, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I do think when it comes to education, what I feel is more of a concern is, students, especially young students, if they've been educated digitally, especially during COVID, their lack of social interaction. And so that directly impacts their empathy, their ability to communicate, their social skills. I think a lot of those soft skills are sort of what I would worry about more in terms of the cognitive abilities. I look at a little bit, I compare a little bit. Obviously, it's a little bit different. I look at it as when you used to do math. And again, you're not going to remember this, but we used to have to do math and you used to have to do it
Without
manually.
calculators.
And actually,
Yeah.
yeah, and sometimes a part of the test was to actually like show me the work for doing long division, show me the work for doing multiplication. And I want to
Yeah.
see you on the paper, where you put the little extra one, if you're adding it, subtracting it, dividing it. I want to see all the work. And then calculators, came around. And then when you're doing, nowadays, when you look at SAT, GMATs, any of those standardized tests, the questions have to be asked differently. And so, in that same regard, when it comes to, I think a lot of things like essays, when it comes to math, the
Mm,
questions and sort of the critical thinking
mm.
teachers, it has to evolve. You can no longer do, test on sort of the technical aspects. It can't just be, your test can't be full of numbers. I mean, I
Yeah.
remember there was a time you would get a piece of paper and there were like, 40 questions on there. And it was things like, 5 times 6, like 3 times 5, and it's like, well, that doesn't test me anymore because, like, if I have a calculator, I just punch that stuff in, and
So true.
it's not practical to not use a calculator because, that's just not how the world works anymore, right? And so now the education has to evolve, the education has to change, and then this is like a whole other discussion, but it's about, sort of how do students nowadays gain the skills that they need to learn. So it becomes more about creativity. It becomes more about critical thinking. When it comes to critical thinking, rather than just technically, what does this equal? What does this mean? It becomes, okay, so if here's a problem that you need to solve, how do you solve it? And maybe that includes math, maybe that includes language, maybe that also includes science to some respect. But a lot of the areas of traditional teaching methods and different ways that have been used in the past, that all needs to evolve and transform. And so I think a lot of that is on, the education system and how that will evolve. Obviously, parents and the general community are always part of that learning ecosystem. But that's where I kind of see that evolving to, or need to
Very
evolve to. Yeah.
100%, 100%. Very insightful. And I completely agree. While AI might influence cognitive tasks, it's the social and empathy building skills that could be more at risk, like you said, especially after the digital shift during COVID-19. I think that's where the problem lies. But your comparison to the evolution of math education is spot on. Just like how calculators changed the way math was taught and tested, AI might just push educators to rethink how they assess problem solving and critical thinking in the classroom, because like AI, generative AI only came out like around 2 years ago. And before that, in my freshman, sophomore year, I still had to write code in paper, like, for
Right.
as testing. But I don't think that's very smart to do anymore, right? So definitely see a point
Exactly.
there. Definitely see a point there. Now, Mayfan, shifting to the entrepreneurial side of things, one last question for you. What advice would you give to current entrepreneurs who are looking to integrate AI into their business models or even build AI centric companies? What are the key considerations and pitfalls they should keep in mind?
Yeah, so there's so many different ways to, to look at this. So one of the first things I'll say about technology is it's really become such a distraction for us. So there more and more folks are distracted all the time, myself included. So it used to be, I could sit down for an hour and do one thing and finish it. And nowadays, you've got the phone ringing, you've got the computer ringing, you've got notifications about news everywhere. There's a lot of different ways that I think, as an entrepreneur, especially, you need to stay focused and you need to really focus on what you care about and what your mission is. Because without that focus, you will be drawn in 100 different ways each day. And don't just chase trends. Everyone's sort of all over AI right now, and I've seen a lot of different companies, that we've reviewed, and the ones that are not focused, that are kind of all over the place chasing trends. You kind of see that right away when you talk to the CEO and you ask them questions about what they're focused on, what's the problem they're trying to solve. And I think that's a huge part of it, is staying focused and understanding what it is that you're really trying to build. and understanding the problem that you're really trying to solve.
Mm.
I would say, definitely prioritize a data centric approach. So there's a lot of data out there, and we always used to say this: garbage in is garbage out. And again, it kind of goes back to the same thing around focus and really understanding, what are the key metrics that your investors care about? What are the key metrics that you care about? What are the key things that you're trying to achieve, the key objectives? How are you measuring that impact? How are you measuring those KPIs? And so being very, very focused on making sure that you are collecting the right data, that you're implementing the right processes in order to generate the right outcomes. I also think it's important to stay agile and be adaptive. With technology now, things change so quickly. And I've seen, we've all seen, right, sort of the trends that have happened over the last few years. One day it's the most interesting and unique thing, and the next day it's actually completely different. So it's very important to be able to adapt and be able to, kind of see what's going on in the marketplace. One of the things we kind of talked about earlier was geopolitically, depending on what markets are like, different companies, different methodologies are perceived differently. So it's important that you are kind of, making sure you're targeting your audience appropriately, you understand your audience, and you're able to adapt and grow as needed, because you need to constantly keep learning. It used to be that, you think like, you go to school, you graduate, maybe you do grad school, maybe you get your PhD, and then sort of, that's it. Oh my gosh, I know everything. That is definitely not the case. Every day, every single time I meet somebody new, every time I read something, I learn something new. And, continuous learning is so important. And you need to always be learning, always be open minded, and always seek different perspectives. From a diversity perspective, we've sort of seen a shift over the years. It's kind of sort of gone from one extreme to the other, with companies sort of, talking about DEI all the time to completely scrapping it, to completely going the opposite direction. For me, diversity is so important, not just from, that it's from a social responsibility perspective, not just from the fact that it is absolutely the right thing to do. It's very, very important to provide opportunities for those who are underserved, underrepresented, who don't have the same opportunities, as many of us do. But also from a business perspective as well. It's not a charity project. It's not something that you do because you feel like you need to. It's also something that makes sense from business perspective. There's been tons of data that has shown, diverse teams make the best decisions, they have the best outcomes. Diverse leaders create the best businesses, they manage the best businesses. And so that's something that continually needs to be built in, and something that we talked about earlier, biases in terms of AI and whatnot as well. We need to make sure that those leaders and those the businesses are building tools, and
Mm.
especially with AI, that's serving the generations, and that's, doing it in the right way so that it's not perpetuating biases across the board.
100%. Like DEI initiatives is such a great thing. And I love when, because of these initiatives, companies form diverse teams. And like you said, statistically speaking, that's how they perform better. And the key takeaway that I got from your advice was adapt or perish, and I couldn't agree more.
Yep.
Technology, and also then you also spoke about how technology can easily become a distraction. And it's so important for entrepreneurs to stay laser focused on their core mission, especially with our like increasingly low attention spans, especially as Gen Z. It's so
Yes.
important to be laser focused. And chasing trends without a clear purpose is something we see all that often, especially with the current hype around AI. Like your point about being intentional with how AI fits into your business rather than just jumping on the bandwagon is something every entrepreneur should really take to heart. As we wrap up today, I want to reflect on everything we've learned from you, from how AI is transforming industries like agriculture to its impact on investment strategies and even the ethical considerations that come with it. You've given us a lot to think about. And also your perspective on how AI can enhance but also challenge education, and your balanced take on integrating AI into businesses is truly, truly lightning. For our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Simple Tech Talk. I hope you found this discussion as insightful as I did. And of course, a huge, huge thank you to you, Meifan, for sharing your expertise and experiences with us. It's been such a pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really great.
Awesome.